There's a moment in every great story when everything changes, when a single choice sends ripples through time, shaping destinies and forging legends. Tonight, we step into one of those moments, deep in the shadowed past of Middle-earth, where the air still hums with the echoes of Morgoth's dark reign. Picture this, a brilliant and restless spirit named Mairon, a being of light and wisdom, standing at the edge of a decision that will alter the fate of all. He could have walked the path of his kin, embracing the harmony of creation, but something darker called to him, a hunger for order, for control, for a world bent to his will. And so, the first whispers of Sauron began. Where are you listening from tonight, and what hour has found you? Let us know in the comments below, because this journey into the heart of darkness is one we're taking together. Long before the One Ring ever felt the heat of Mount Doom, before the armies of Mordor marched under black banners, there was only a Maia with a vision. Mairon wasn't always the Dark Lord we know. Once he was a craftsman, a scholar, a mind unmatched in his pursuit of perfection. But perfection, when twisted by pride, can become a prison. The more he sought to reshape the world, the further he strayed from the light, until the shadows themselves seemed to whisper his new name, Sauron. This is where his story truly begins, not in the fires of war, but in the quiet, searing moment when a single choice tipped the scales toward darkness. What makes a villain? Is it destiny, or is it the slow, relentless pull of ambition? As we trace Sauron's origins, we're not just unraveling the history of Middle-earth, we're peering into the mirror of power itself. How easily might any of us, faced with the same temptations, stumble down that same path? Tonight, we'll walk through the forgotten chapters of his rise, from the ruins of Morgoth's empire to the forging of the Rings of Power. This isn't just a tale of evil, it's a warning etched in myth, a reminder that even the brightest minds can fall when they mistake control for glory. So settle in, and let's journey back to the beginning, where the first threads of darkness were woven. The story awaits. The forge was Mairon's sanctuary, a place where fire and metal bent to his will, where creation took shape under his skilled hands. Among the Maiar, none matched his precision. Each alloy he crafted gleamed with flawless symmetry. Every design hummed with invisible power. But perfection, for him, was never enough. While others marveled at his work, he saw only the flaws, a seam too visible, a resonance slightly uneven. The Valor spoke of patience, of allowing the world to grow at its own pace. But to Mairon, their complacency was madness. Why let chaos linger when order could be imposed? Why tolerate imperfection when it could be mastered? Aulë, the smith of the Valor, saw the storm brewing in his apprentice's heart. He praised Mairon's skill, but warned against the pride that comes with it. Even the finest blade must yield to the hand that wields it, he said, his voice kind but firm. The words stung. To Mairon, they weren't wisdom. They were shackles. The forge's flames, usually a source of clarity, now seemed to whisper rebellion. What if the world didn't need gentle guidance? What if it needed a hand strong enough to reshape it entirely? In the quiet hours, when the workshops lay empty, Mairon began experimenting with darker arts, melding not just metal, but the very essence of Arda itself. He sought to bind energy to form, to force the unseen into submission. The first time, a shadow clung to his creation, twisting it into something sharper, hungrier, he didn't recoil. He marveled. Here was power unbound by the Valor's rules, a path to the order he craved. The firelight cast his silhouette against the walls, stretching it into something unrecognizable, a shape not of a craftsman, but of something far more dangerous. The decision wasn't made in a single moment. It was the sum of 1,000 whispers, each one pulling him further from the light, and with every step, the name, Mairon, felt smaller, a relic of a self he was leaving behind. The whispers reached Mairon like smoke, curling through cracks, hints of a power that defied the Valor's careful order, a force that shaped the world, not with gentle hands, but with iron will. Morgoth's name was spoken in dread across Middle-earth, yet to Mairon, it sparked something darker, fascination. Here was a being who refused to kneel, who saw chaos not as a flaw to mend, but as clay to mold. The more Mairon listened, the more the Valor's teachings felt like chains. What was harmony, if not stagnation? What was patience, if not surrender? Their first meeting was no chance encounter. Morgoth had watched the brilliant Maia from afar, sensing the restless ambition beneath his polished creations. When Mairon finally stood before him, the fallen Vala didn't offer threats or demands, he offered a vision. Imagine a world without wasted potential, Morgoth murmured, his voice like embers glowing in the dark. No flawed designs, no half measures, only perfection, enforced by a will strong enough to demand it. The words slithered into Mairon's mind, echoing his own frustrations. Here was someone who understood the hunger he'd buried, the unspoken belief that order required mastery, not cooperation. Yet loyalty lingered like a stubborn ember. Aulë's teachings, the kinship of the Maiar, these weren't easily cast aside. For a fleeting moment, Mairon wavered. But Morgoth knew the weight of temptation. You were never meant to serve, he pressed, pressing a hand to the forge-heated metal between them. You were meant to rule. The metal hissed, twisting under his touch into something sharper, crueler. Mairon's breath caught. This was power unapologetic, unbound. No committees of valor debating the ethics of creation, just pure, unfiltered will. The choice wasn't made in grandeur. No thunder cracked, no armies rallied. It happened in the silence of a shared glance, the slow nod of a craftsman, recognizing a kindred spirit. When Mairon knelt, it wasn't in submission, it was in alliance. Morgoth's laughter rang like a hammer striking anvil, sealing the pact. The Maia, who'd once polished gems for the Valor, now lifted his head with a new purpose, to reshape Middle-earth by any means necessary. The name, Sauron, still waited in the wings, but the transformation had begun. From this moment forward, every act, every design, would carry the fingerprints of corruption. What does corruption look like before it wears a crown? Not in grand proclamations, but in quiet compromises. Mairon didn't wake that morning planning betrayal. He simply stopped resisting the pull of his own pride. And that's how darkness often wins, not by force, but by convincing you it was your idea all along. Under Morgoth's shadow, Mairon's craft took on a new edge. No longer the delicate artistry of a scholar, but the brutal precision of a warlord. The forges of Angband became his domain, their fires stoked not by the gentle breath of creation, but by the searing winds of conquest. Here, he hammered swords that drank light, armor that twisted the wearer's spirit, and siege engines that cracked the earth itself. Each creation was a masterpiece of malice, a testament to how far his skill had fallen from the Valor's teachings. Yet Morgoth praised him, and in those moments, Mairon's pride burned brighter than the furnaces around him. He told himself this was order, true order, forged not through compromise, but through domination. But the screams followed him. They clung to the halls of Ang, bent like smoke, seeping into the cracks between his thoughts. Elves chained in the pits, men broken on the rack, their cries were the chorus to his work. At first, he dismissed them as the necessary cost of progress. What were a few lives against the perfection of a world reshaped? Yet as Morgoth's cruelty grew wilder, more gratuitous, the weight of those voices grew heavier. A flicker of something long buried stirred in Mairon's chest, not compassion, not yet, but unease, doubt. Late one night, deep in the bowels of the fortress, he caught sight of a prisoner through the bars of a cell. Not a warrior, not a rebel, just a child, hollow-eyed and trembling. The boy didn't beg, he simply stared, as if he already knew mercy was a myth. Mairon froze, the blueprints in his hands suddenly brittle as old parchment. For the first time in centuries, his certainty wavered. What was the purpose of all this suffering? What kingdom could be built on bones that never stopped screaming? But Morgoth's voice slithered into his mind before the thought could take root. Sentiment is the chains of the weak, he murmured, materializing from the shadows like a fever dream. You, my disciple, were made for greater things. The words coiled around Mairon's hesitation, smothering it. He straightened, shoving the moment aside. If doubt was a crack in his armor, he would mend it with resolve. The child's whimpers faded behind him as he strode back to the forge, his hands steady once more. But the silence that followed wasn't empty. It hummed with the unspoken question. How many more cracks could he ignore before the whole facade shattered? The answer, it seemed, would wait. For now, the hammers fell, the fires roared, and Mairon buried his disquiet beneath another layer of gleaming, terrible steel. Morgoth's command was a blade pressed to Mairon's throat, a test disguised as an honor. Gondolin falls by your hand, the Dark Lord declared, his voice dripping with the promise of reward or punishment. The city was the last great stronghold of the Elves, a gleaming thorn in Morgoth's side, and its destruction would prove Mairon's worth once and for all. He threw himself into the task with chilling precision, mapping every weakness in the hidden city's defenses, turning its famed beauty into a blueprint for ruin. Balrogs coiled at his command, dragons blackened the sky, and orcs surged like a tide of rusted blades. This was order, he told himself, the kind that could only be carved with fire and blood. Yet Gondolin fought back with a fury that startled him. The elves did not crumble as he'd predicted. Their arrows found gaps in his formations. Their valor turned his careful plans to chaos. And then there was Selibramber, the king's daughter, who stood atop the crumbling walls with a defiance that burned brighter than the flames. She rallied the survivors, her voice cutting through the smoke like a silver bell. Mairon watched, transfixed, as she shepherded children through secret tunnels, her resolve unshaken even as the city collapsed around her. For the first time, his certainty wavered. What was the point of domination if it only bred more resistance? What order could rise from ashes that refused to cool? The moment passed in a heartbeat, but the unease lingered. As Gondolin's towers fell, Mairon found himself staring at his own reflection in a puddle of molten gold. The face that stared back was twisted, unfamiliar. The siege was a victory, yet it tasted like ash. Morgoth's laughter boomed through the ruins, praising his lieutenant's brutality, but the words rang hollow. In Idril's defiance, Mairon had glimpsed something he couldn't name, a light that didn't bend, a will that couldn't be broken. The realization slithered under his skin like a splinter of glass. If strength alone couldn't conquer such spirit, then what had he spent centuries serving? The fires of Gondolin smoldered for days, painting the sky the color of old bruises. Mairon stood amidst the wreckage, his armor streaked with soot, the weight of his choices pressing down like a physical thing. The city was gone, but its echo refused to fade. For the first time, the whispers of doubt grew louder than the roar of the forge. The silence after Morgoth's fall was deafening. For centuries, the din of Angban's forges and the screams of war had filled Mairon's days. Now there was only the hollow echo of his own footsteps through ruined halls. The Valor's victory had shattered his world, leaving him not just defeated, but untethered. What use was a craftsman without a master, a strategist without an army? The question gnawed at him as he wandered the scorched remains of Thangorodrim, his hands itching for the familiar weight of a hammer, the heat of a forge. But the fires were cold, the anvils overturned. In the quiet, a dangerous thought took root, repentance. It flickered at the edges of his mind, fragile as a moth drawn to flame. What if he laid down his designs, knelt before the Valor, and begged for the mercy they so loved to preach? The image sickened him. Humiliation coiled in his chest like a serpent. To admit failure, to grovel before those who'd never understood his vision. No, better to fade into myth than surrender. Yet as he gazed at the wreckage of Morgoth's empire, another truth settled over him like ash. Without a cause, he was nothing. A tool without a hand to wield it, so he did what he'd always done. He reinvented himself. The name, Mairon, belonged to a ghost, a fool who'd believed in Morgoth's promises. What rose from the ashes was something sharper, smoother, cloaked in cunning rather than brute force. Sauron. The shadows murmured as he tested the syllables on his tongue. It fit like armor, no longer the second-hand villain, the disciple in Morgoth's shadow. This time, he would be the architect. The Valor had shown their weakness in victory. They'd allowed their enemies to live, to rebuild. A mistake he wouldn't repeat. His first move was subtle. In the east, far from the eyes of elves and gods, whispers began to spread of a benevolent spirit who walked among mortals, offering gifts beyond imagining. A lord who asked for nothing in return, or so it seemed. To starving tribes, he brought secrets of agriculture, turning wastelands into wheat fields. To warring chieftains, he offered weapons that never dulled, forged with knowledge lost to time. Each boon was a thread, carefully woven into the fabric of their dependence. They called him Annatar, the Lord of Gifts, never suspecting the noose hidden in the silk. But in the dead of night, when even the wind held its breath, Sauron returned to the ruins of Angband. Here, where the air still stank of Morgoth's arrogance, he knelt and pressed his palms to the cracked earth. The foundations of his new kingdom wouldn't be built on terror. Not at first. Fear was a blunt instrument. Instead, he'd give them order, prosperity, purpose. Let them love their chains before they felt their weight. The shadows stirred in agreement, curling around his wrists like loyal serpents. Somewhere beyond the mountains, the elves sang of peace, of an age unbroken by darkness. Their joy was his opportunity. Every hymn to harmony was a distraction. Every moment of safety, a chance for him to dig deeper. The game had changed, but the player remained. And this time, he wouldn't just conquer Middle-earth, he'd convince it to hand him the crown. The elves of a region never saw the serpent in their midst, only the gold of his promises. When Annatar arrived, cloaked in light and bearing gifts of forgotten lore, they greeted him as a savior. His hands, smooth and unscarred by war, carried scrolls of ancient techniques, diagrams of devices that could bend metal and magic alike. To Selibramber, grandson of the great Fëanor, here was a kindred spirit, a craftsman who spoke not of conquest, but of creation. How could he have known that every shared secret, every whispered confidence, was a thread in a web centuries in the weaving? Selibramber's forge became a temple of collaboration, its fire stoked by ambition and mutual admiration. Annatar's suggestions were always gentle, his guidance patient. Why stop at replicating the past? He murmured one evening, tracing a finger along the edge of an unfinished circlet. Your grandfather's works were brilliant, but imagine surpassing them. Not with brute force, but with elegance, with rings that don't just adorn, but empower. The words struck like a hammer on hot iron. Selibramber, haunted by the shadow of his lineage, saw in Annatar the mentor he'd always craved. Together, they began experimenting with alloys that hummed with latent energy, their workshops alive with the chime of hammers and the scent of molten mithril. The first ring they forged together was a marvel, a band so light it seemed to float on the wearer's finger, yet pulsing with a quiet, radiant strength. Selibramber held it up to the lamplight, his breath catching at the way it caught and refracted the glow. "It's alive," he whispered. Annatar smiled, his eyes reflecting the shimmer like twin pools of liquid gold. "All great art is," he replied. What the elven smith didn't notice was how the shadows in the room bent ever so slightly toward his companion, as if drawn by an unseen current. 16 rings followed, each more intricate than the last. Selibramber poured his soul into them, believing they were gifts to preserve elvenkind, tools to heal lands scarred by war, to slow the decay of time itself. Annatar praised each creation, but his gaze lingered on the flaws only he could see. A resonance too pure here, a binding too weak there. These weren't mistakes. They were vulnerabilities he'd engineered, tiny fractures where his will could someday take root. While Selibramber dreamed of legacy, Annatar calculated. The rings were keys, and he was crafting the locks they'd open. Then came the 3. Selibramber worked on these alone, driven by a sudden unease he couldn't name. Perhaps it was the way Annatar's questions had grown sharper, his presence more persistent, or perhaps it was the dream that woke him sweating, a vision of molten gold seeping into the veins of the world, twisting everything it touched. Whatever the reason, he forged the last rings in secret, using techniques Annatar had never taught him. Narya, Nenya, Vilya. Their powers were subtle, their designs untainted. When he slipped them onto his fingers for the first time, the metal felt cool against his skin, the magic within humming in harmony rather than submission. A whisper of warning curled through his mind. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed. He never got the chance to share his doubts. By the time the truth tore through a region like wildfire, that Annatar's fair form had melted away to reveal the lidless eye, that the rings they'd crafted were shackles in disguise, Selibramber stood alone in his workshop, staring at the empty space where his friend had stood. The air still smelled of lilacs, Annatar's favorite bloom, a cruel joke that the greatest betrayals always wear the sweetest perfumes. In the fires of Mount Doom, far from the elven halls he'd corrupted, Sauron smiled as he hammered the one ring into being. The other rings had been tests, prototypes. This was the masterpiece. As the gold took shape under his hands, he could almost feel the threads connecting it to the others, invisible cords tugging at the wills of kings, scholars, warriors. Selibramber's defiance with the three had been a setback, but no matter. Even the purest magic could be turned in time. The ring glowed as he lifted it, its surface flawless, its purpose absolute. One by one, all would bend, and when they did, Middle-earth would finally learn the price of trusting light that came bearing gifts. Selibramber's hands trembled as he unrolled the latest schematics Annatar had left behind, a design so perfect it felt wrong. The curves of the metalwork mirrored the veins of a leaf. The gem settings pulsed with a rhythm like a heartbeat, but the calculations in the margins, those were the work of something far colder than any artisan. Numbers that accounted not just for weight and balance, but for the precise moment a soul might fracture under pressure. He'd seen such equations once before, etched into the walls of Angband during his years of captivity. The realization struck like a dagger to the ribs. Annatar had never been a teacher. He'd been a sculptor, molding a region's trust into the perfect weapon. When confronted, the mask didn't crack. It melted. One moment, Annatar stood bathed in forged light, his golden hair catching the glow like a halo. The next, the air around him warped, the scent of lilacs curdling into sulfur. His features blurred, then sharpened into something terrible. Eyes like polished obsidian, a smile too wide for any living face. "You were always the clever one," Sauron murmured, his voice no longer honeyed but hollow, echoing as if from the bottom of a well. But cleverness without power is just noise. Selibramber refused to flinch. He'd hidden the three rings where even Sauron's gaze couldn't reach, their magic woven into the very bones of the earth. "You'll never touch them," he said, fingers tightening around the hammer at his belt, not a weapon, but a symbol, the tool of a maker, not a destroyer. Sauron's laugh scraped against the stones like nails on slate. "Oh, I don't need to," he whispered. "I just need you to watch what happens next." The first fires erupted at dawn. Orcs swarmed the city gates not as a disorganized horde, but in perfect, silent ranks, a nightmare of discipline. Sauron had taught them more than cruelty. He'd taught them strategy. Eregion's defenders fell like wheat before the scythe, their bravery meaningless against the precision of slaughter. Selibramber fought in the streets, his robes stained with ash and blood, shouting orders that were drowned beneath the screams. He'd built this city to withstand sieges, but not this. Not an enemy who knew every weakness, every shortcut, because he'd helped design them. The last stand came at the house of the Murdain. The great hall, where they'd once debated philosophy over spiced wine, now reeked of burning tapestries and charred flesh. Sauron entered alone, his footsteps eerily measured. He found Selibramber kneeling, not in surrender, but exhaustion, his hands still clenched around the broken shards of a shattered anvil. "Where are the rings?" Sauron demanded, his voice a lash of flame. The elf lord lifted his head, his smile a ghost of its former brilliance. "Where you'll never reach them." What followed wasn't an execution, it was a performance. Sauron made sure the city watched as he strung Selibramber's broken body upon a pole, a banner of flesh and bone raised high above the smoldering ruins. The message was clear: defiance had a price, and Sauron would make art from the paying of it. Yet as the smoke curled into the sky, something unexpected happened. The wind carried whispers not of despair, but of a single elven child's voice, singing a lullaby older than the stars. The song spread, voice by voice, until it rang through the ruins like a bell. Sauron's victory was absolute, his enemy broken, but the light he'd sought to extinguish, that it seemed, was harder to kill than he'd reckoned. With Eregion's towers reduced to smoldering rubble, Sauron stood amidst the wreckage, his fingers curling around the spoils of war, the lesser rings, those early experiments Selibramber had crafted under his guidance. They hummed against his palm like caged birds, their power subdued but not yet broken. A smile twisted his lips. These were not the three, those elusive treasures hidden beyond his reach, but they would serve their purpose. Every ring, no matter how small, was a thread in the tapestry of control he was weaving. The road to Mordor stretched before him, a winding path through ash-choked valleys and jagged peaks. This land had once been Morgoth's stronghold, a place of suffocating darkness, but Sauron saw potential in its bones. Here, the earth itself remembered cruelty, and the mountains whispered secrets of fire and shadow. Orodruin loomed ahead, its peak veiled in smoke, the heartbeat of the land pulsing beneath his feet. This was where his masterpiece would be born, not in the delicate forges of elves, but in the belly of a mountain that had thirsted for dominion long before he ever walked its slopes. The fires of Orodruin did not merely burn, they sang. A chorus of raw power echoed through the caverns as Sauron approached the chasm, the heat searing the air into rippling waves. He raised the crucible, its golden contents already shimmering with the promise of what was to come. This was no ordinary metal. It was a vessel waiting to be filled. As the molten gold cascaded into the mold, Sauron began the incantation, words older than the stars themselves slithering from his lips. Each syllable was a drop of venom, each phrase a chain. He poured more than malice into the swirling gold. He poured his very essence, the core of his being, the unyielding will that had carried him from Mairon's forge to this moment of triumph. The ring took shape slowly, its surface flawless, its weight both impossibly light and unbearably heavy. When he lifted it from the fire, the world seemed to shudder. A shadow unfurled from Mount Doom like ink in water, creeping across the land, dimming the sun itself. Far away, in the golden halls of Lothlorien and the marble courtyards of Rivendell, the elves felt it, a cold finger tracing their spines, a whisper in the back of their minds that hadn't been there before. The three rings on their fingers grew warm, then hot, as if warning them of a presence they could not see. Sauron slipped the one ring onto his finger, and for the first time in centuries, he felt whole. The connection was instant, 1,000 invisible threads snapping taut between him and the lesser rings, their bearers suddenly laid bare before his will. Kings and warriors, scholars and smiths, None would escape the pull of his design. The shadow deepened, stretching farther with every passing second. But Sauron did not laugh in triumph. He simply stood there, silent, watching the world bend. Yet even as the darkness spread, something flickered at the edges of his perception. A resistance, faint but unbroken. The three rings remained beyond his grasp, their light untarnished. And somewhere, in the ruins of a region, a single shard of mithril caught the dying sun, gleaming defiantly in the ashes. The war for Middle-earth had only just begun. The moment the one ring slid onto Sauron's finger, the elves knew. A shiver raced through the bearers of the three Galadriel's fingers, tightening around Nenya's band. Elrond's breath, catching as Vilya pulsed like a warning bell. The air itself seemed to recoil, thick with the taste of forged dominion. Without a word, they slipped their rings from their fingers, severing the invisible threads Sauron had woven into their design. The backlash was instant. Across Middle-earth, kings and warriors who'd worn the lesser rings clutched their heads as whispers slithered into their minds. But the three, their light flickered and held. Sauron's roar shook the towers of Barad-dûr. Centuries of planning, the perfect architecture of control, undone by elven intuition. His rage wasn't just fury. It was the outrage of a craftsman whose masterpiece had been smeared by clumsy hands. Armies surged from Mordor like a tidal wave of rust and fangs, their march shaking the earth. This wasn't conquest anymore, it was reclamation. Every elf stronghold would burn until the rings were pried from their corpses, but the children of Iluvatar refused to cower. In the shadow of looming war, an alliance sparked where old grudges might have festered. Gil-galad, High King of the Noldor, stood beside Elendil of Númenor. Their ancestors had been foes, their peoples tangled in betrayals. Yet here, on the ash-choked plains of Dagorlad, they clasped forearms over a shared purpose: break the Dark Lord's grip, or watch the world fade into chains. Their combined forces glittered like a blade in sunlight, elven spears precise as poetry, Númenorian steel, honed by generations of exile. Even the wild men of the mountains lending their axes to the cause. The battle was a storm of blood and fire. For every orc that fell, 3 more clambered over its corpse. Trolls waded through the fray, their hides slick with gore, while Nazgûl circled overhead, their shrieks peeling courage from men's hearts. Yet step by brutal step, the Alliance advanced, driving Sauron's legions back toward Orodruin's fiery throat. The Dark Lord himself emerged at last, a colossus wreathed in black flame, mace swinging in arcs that shattered the ground. Gil-galad and Elendil met him together, their weapons flashing Eglo's star-tipped gleam against Narsil's reforged brilliance. Sauron laughed as they closed in. What were 2 mortals, however noble, against the might of a Maia? He batted aside their blows like a bear swatting at bees, his every strike carving craters in the earth. But arrogance made him careless. When Elendil's sword bit deep into his armored shin, Sauron staggered, just enough for Gil-galad to dart beneath his guard. The Elven King's spear found a chink in the blackened plate, piercing upward with all the light of the undying lands behind it. Sauron howled, swinging blindly, his mace crushing Gil-galad's chest, even as the spear's fire seared his own flesh. Elendil, seeing his comrade fall, brought Narsil down with a cry that echoed his ancestors' vengeance, the blade shearing through Sauron's armored fingers, severing the one ring in a burst of molten gold. The Dark Lord's form exploded outward, a shockwave of darkness, scattering the survivors like leaves in a gale. When the dust settled, only his hollow armor remained, clattering empty against the rocks. The ring, though, that endured, cooled and gleaming amid the wreckage, it whispered promises to any who passed. Isildur, Elendil's heir, lifted it from the bloodied earth, deaf to Elrond's warnings. The war was won, but the shadow that was merely waiting. Victory had come at a cost too vast to measure. Gil-galad's body lay broken beside his spear. His song ended. Elendil's sword had shattered with its final blow, its shards glinting like tears in the ash. And Isildur, he turned away from Mount Doom's fires, the ring coiled around his finger, already murmuring of kingship and power. Some defeats are louder than victories. Some victories plant the seeds of the next war. The battlefield fell silent, but the war was far from over. Though Isildur walked away with the ring glinting on his finger, Sauron's essence refused to fade. Like smoke clinging to the wind, his spirit fractured but did not disperse, scattered, yet still aware. A lesser being might have surrendered to the void, but Sauron had spent centuries learning the art of patience. The ring had been severed from his hand, but the bond between them thrummed like a plucked string, vibrating across the leagues. It called to him, a siren song only he could hear, and so he listened. In the beginning, he was little more than a whisper in the dark corners of Middle-earth, a sigh in the ears of kings as they slept, a flicker of doubt in the hearts of rulers already teetering on the edge of tyranny. He had no body, no fortress, no armies, only the slow, insidious power of persuasion. And persuasion, as he'd learned long ago in Morgoth's shadow, was often sharper than any blade. The first to fall were the desperate. A starving chieftain in Rhûn offered visions of endless harvests, if only he pledged loyalty. A Gondorian captain promised victory over his rivals in exchange for a single, unmarked grave dug in secret. Small betrayals at first, but each act of corruption was a thread, and Sauron wove them together with meticulous care. His presence grew stronger in the spaces between words, in the unspoken fears of those who clutched their power too tightly. Then came the Nazgûl. Once kings of men, they had accepted his gifts with open hands, never realizing the rings they wore were nooses in disguise. Now, bound to his will, they became his voice in the world. Their faces, hidden beneath tattered shrouds, were the last thing many would ever see. They moved like shadows, carrying his promises to the weak and his threats to the defiant. With every soul they claimed, Sauron's influence stretched further, his presence coiling around the throats of kingdoms like an unseen hand. The ring, though, that was the key. It had not been destroyed, and so long as it endured, so too did his hope. He could feel it out there, passing from hand to careless hand. Each bearer thought themselves its master, unaware that it was shaping them, hollowing them out like rotten wood. Gollum, creeping through the caves of the misty mountains, muttering to his precious. The ring had twisted him into something barely recognizable, a living testament to its power. And Sauron watched, biding his time, gathering his strength. For centuries, Middle-earth believed the Dark Lord was gone. They rebuilt their cities, sang their victory songs, and let their guard down. A fatal mistake. In the east, orcs multiplied in hidden strongholds. In Dol Guldur, a shadow thickened beneath the trees, too formless to name but heavy with malice. And in the whispers of men who craved dominion over their fellows, a familiar voice began to murmur once more. The game had changed, but the player remained. And this time, he would not be so easily undone. The ashes of defeat had been swept away by the winds of time, and in their place rose the dark towers of Barad-dûr, stone by terrible stone. Saurons will shape the land itself, rivers choked on slag. The earth split to reveal veins of fire, and the very air thickened with the reek of industry. Mordor was no longer a ruin, it was a forge, hammering out the instruments of dominion, yet the Dark Lord's ambitions stretched far beyond his borders. Like poison, seeping through roots, his influence crept into the fractured kingdoms of men. In Gondor, the white tree shed its last leaves, its gnarled branches a skeletal silhouette against the moon. The stewards who ruled in the absence of a king grew paranoid, their councils riddled with whispers of betrayal, whispers Sauron himself had planted. But shadows breed defiance as surely as they hide monsters. In the wilds beyond the Anduin, a figure moved with the quiet certainty of a storm gathering on the horizon. Aragorn, son of Arathorn, bore the weight of his lineage not as a crown, but as a burden he'd spent decades learning to shoulder. He walked paths even orcs feared to tread, his face hidden beneath a hood, his sword hand calloused from both battle and healing. The Rangers of the North knew him as their chieftain, the Elves of Rivendell as Estel, Hope. But in the taverns of Bree, he was just another traveler, ears open to the murmurs of a world unraveling. Sauron, for all his might, could not pierce every shadow. The air of Isildur was a ripple in his designs, a variable unaccounted for. When the Nazgul reported whispers of a man who slipped through their grasp, the Dark Lord's gaze turned westward, probing the darkness. There was something familiar in the way this stranger moved, something that stirred an old, buried memory. The sting of Narsil's edge, the searing pain of fingers severed. The past had a way of repeating itself, but Sauron would not be caught unawares again. In the depths of Barad-dûr, the lidless eye burned with renewed purpose. Armies mustered, spies scattered like crows, and the forges worked ceaselessly. Yet Sauron's greatest weapon remained the fear festering in the hearts of men. Let them fracture, let them doubt, the ring would return to him. It was only a matter of time. But as the Dark Lord plotted, a single candle flickered in the house of Elrond, where maps lay unfurled and alliances were being drawn in hushed voices. The reckoning would not be his alone to summon. The drums of war echoed across the plains of Mordor, a thunderous rhythm that shook the very bones of the earth. Sauron's legions poured forth like a black-tide orc hordes, clattering with rusted blades, trolls hefting siege towers on their backs, and the Nazgul circling overhead on wings of shadow. Minas Tirith, the White City, stood as the last bastion of men, its marble walls glowing faintly against the encroaching darkness. To the Dark Lord, its fall was inevitable. Every calculation, every stratagem had led to this moment. The ring's call grew stronger in his mind, a pulsing beacon he believed no one could resist. His victory was not just probable, it was written in the ashes of every kingdom he'd already crushed. Yet history has a way of humbling even the mightiest. While Sauron's gaze fixed on the grandeur of war, on the clashing armies and crumbling gates, a whisper of movement went unnoticed. A hobbit, small as a mouse, quiet as a falling leaf, picked his way through the wastes of Mordor, a burden heavier than stone clutched in his trembling hands. Frodo's very insignificance became his armor. In a world where Sauron measured strength in armies and terror, the notion that his fate hinged on a creature barely taller than a child was inconceivable. The Dark Lord's mind, vast as it was, could not fathom an enemy who wielded no sword, commanded no troops, and sought no glory, and so the flaw in his design yawned wide. Sauron's arrogance was not the hot, reckless pride of men. It was colder, more absolute, the certainty of a mathematician who believes his equation flawless. He had accounted for Gandalf's wisdom, Aragorn's lineage, even the stubborn valor of Gondor's soldiers, but the courage of the small, the quiet persistence of those who walk unseen. These were variables his calculations had dismissed. As the battle of the Pelennor fields raged, as the dead piled high, and the air thickened with smoke, Frodo and Sam inched closer to Mount Doom, their steps guided by a hope Sauron had long since forgotten existed. The Dark Lord's focus never wavered from the war. He felt the rings pull like a lodestone, unwavering, and assumed its bearer would come to him, drawn by its power, corrupted by its whispers. The thought that someone might resist its call, might choose to destroy it, was beyond his comprehension. After all, who would cast away the very instrument of dominion? Who would refuse the chance to reshape the world? The answer, of course, was someone who valued home over power, friendship over glory, someone Sauron's millennia of malice had left him unable to understand. High in his tower, the lidless eye burned with furious intensity, scanning the battlefield for any threat. But it looked outward, always outward, never down at the two tiny figures scrambling up the slopes of Orodruin, their hands blistered, their hearts frayed, yet their resolve unbroken. The greatest danger to Sauron's reign wasn't an army at his gates. It was the one thing he'd forgotten to fear, the kindness he'd scorned, the humility he'd mocked, the light he'd sworn to extinguish. And by the time he realized his mistake, the cracks in his perfect design would be too wide to mend. The Battle of the Black Gate raged like a storm of steel and fire, the air thick with the stench of blood and burning oil. Sauron's forces surged forward in relentless waves, their numbers seemingly endless, their screams a chorus of mindless fury. High above the carnage, the lidless eye blazed with cold triumph, its gaze fixed on the ragged defenders Aragorn's army, outnumbered and desperate, their backs to the cliffs. Every arrow loosed, every sword swung, was a note in the Dark Lord's symphony of victory. He could taste their fear, their exhaustion. This was the moment he had waited for, the culmination of centuries of patience and planning. Let them fight, let them hope. It would only make their despair sweeter when the last of their strength failed. Then, it happened. A shudder rippled through the earth, so deep it seemed to come from the bones of the world itself. For the first time in millennia, Sauron's certainty fractured. The ring's presence, a constant hum in his mind like a second heartbeat, flickered, then vanished. The silence was deafening. His scream tore through the sky, a sound not of rage but of raw, unthinkable agony. The very fabric of his being unraveled, threads of power snapping one by one. The eye, so vast and terrible moments before, wavered like a reflection in disturbed water. Barad-dûr's obsidian towers groaned, cracks spider, webbing up their flanks as the foundations gave way. The earth heaved, swallowing his armies whole. the land itself rejecting the weight of his darkness. Across Mordor, the shadow that had smothered the sun for generations thinned, then dissolved like smoke in a sudden wind. Orcs dropped their weapons, blinking as if waking from a nightmare, their minds clearing of the hatred that had driven them. The Nazgul's shrieks turned to whispers, then to nothing at all, their forms dissipating like mist under dawn's light. And Sauron, there was no grand explosion, no final curse, just a wisp of malice unraveling into the air, a sigh of something vast and terrible ceasing to be. On the slopes of Mount Doom, where the heat still shimmered above the lava, a single golden band melted into the fire, its whispers fading with it. The war was over. Not with a clash of armies, but with the quiet, irreversible act of two small hands letting go. And as the wind carried the ash away, the first bird song in centuries rang out over the plains of Gorgoroth, tentative, fragile, and impossibly alive. The land breathed again. Rivers once choked with ash ran clear, their waters carving fresh paths through valleys long abandoned. Forests crept back over the ruins of watchtowers, roots splitting stone, as if erasing the very memory of Sauron's dominion. Yet scars remain, twisted spires of Mordor's black rock, jutting like broken teeth, the earth still barren in patches where nothing would grow. Healing, it seemed, was not the same as forgetting. For the Elves, the choice was clear. The rings they'd crafted to preserve their realms had lost their luster. The magic that once shimmered in Lothlorien's leaves now flickered like a dying candle. One by one, they boarded white ships in the havens, their voices softer than they'd been in ages, their eyes fixed on the horizon. The sea longing had always been there, a whisper beneath their songs. Now it roared. Middle-earth had been their home for millennia, but the weight of its history, of wars waged, treasures lost, and shadows endured, had grown too heavy. They left behind empty halls where echoes of their laughter lingered, and kingdoms that would live on only in ballads. Men, though, had no such refuge. Gondor's banners fluttered over rebuilt walls, its streets bustling with masons and merchants, but the air carried a new tension. The glory of Numenor was a half-remembered dream. The throne sat empty, its lineage fractured. Aragorn's coronation brought hope, yet even he could not erase the lessons written in blood. In taverns and council chambers, the question hummed beneath every conversation: how long before another rises in the Dark Lord's stead? The answer lurked in the way old alliances still frayed at the edges, in the greed that flared when crowns were polished a little too brightly. And then there were the whispers. Shepherds in the foothills of the misty mountains spoke of cold spots in summer meadows, of shadows that moved against the wind. Fishermen near the ruins of Dol Guldur swore they heard voices in the reeds. No words, just a hissing like steam on hot stone. Even in the Shire, where firelight and pipe smoke drowned out most fears, Bilbo's old tales took on a darker hue. Evil, it seemed, was not a flame to be snuffed out, but an ember. Left untended, it might smolder for an age, but given the right wind, the dwarves, ever practical, carved new halls deeper into the earth, their songs louder to drown out the silence above. The Ents, slow as ever, murmured of patience, of watching, waiting, and in the farthest east, where maps faded into legend, drums still thumped in hidden places, their rhythm just out of step with the world's healing heartbeat. Sauron was gone. His lesson remained. Darkness thrives not in its strength, but in the cracks of what we fail to mend. Somewhere, in the space between a sigh and a shudder, the wind carried a sound too soft for most to hear. Not a voice, not a threat, just the faintest suggestion of a laugh. Dry as dead leaves, the age of magic had ended. The age of vigilance had just begun. Centuries after Sauron's shadow faded from Middle-earth, scholars still bend over crumbling scrolls and whisper arguments in torchlit halls. Was the Dark Lord's path written in the stars from the beginning, or did each choice, each whispered compromise, carve his descent like chisel marks in stone? The ruins of his forges offer no answers, only the silent testimony of blackened anvils and rusted chains. Yet the debate lingers, not just as academic exercise, but as a mirror held up to every soul who's ever tasted power and wondered how far they might go. Some point to his earliest days as Mairon, the admirable, his brilliance undeniable, his hunger for perfection already gnawing at him. Look at his designs, they say, tracing fingerless gloves over ancient blueprints. Even then, his work sought to control as much as create. The alloys he crafted weren't just beautiful, they hummed with a desire to fix the world's imperfections, to force harmony through mastery. Could such a mind ever have been content with the Valor's patient ways? Or was rebellion coiled in his bones from the start, waiting for Morgoth's whisper to set it loose? Others argue it was the choices that damned him small at first, then irreversible, the moment he dismissed all his warnings as weakness, the day he first twisted a creation to serve cruelty rather than craft. Even his alliance with Morgoth, they insist, wasn't inevitable. He stood at the edge so many times, murmurs an elf scholar in Rivendell's archives, her fingers brushing a fresco of Annatar's fair face. One different choice, one moment of humility, and history might remember him as a savior rather than a scourge. Yet the most chilling theory isn't about destiny or decisions, it's about scale. Sauron didn't wake one day twirling a mustache and cackling over conquest. He believed, truly believed, that his vision of order would save Middle-earth from itself. The orcs, necessary enforcers, the rings, tools to guide lesser beings toward unity. By the time the screams of Gondolin's children haunted him, he'd already justified them as sacrifices on the altar of a greater good. That's the true warning etched in his story. Corruption isn't a cliff you leap from, but a slope you inch down, each step reasoned away until the abyss yawns beneath you. Today, the free peoples rebuild, but they do so with one eye on the past. In Gondor's citadel, stewards weigh decrees with Narsil shards displayed behind them, a reminder that even broken blades can mend. The dwarves chant ballads of Durin's bane, not to glorify the darkness under the mountain, but to remember the cost of digging too deep. And in the Shire, where the grass grows thick over battlefields no hobbit ever saw, a single line is carved above Bilbo's study. All that is gold does not glitter, but not all that glitters is gold. The lesson of Sauron isn't just that power corrupts, it's that corruption wears 1,000 masks, sometimes a crown, sometimes a craftsman's apron, sometimes a smile offering gifts too perfect to refuse. The forges are cold now, but the embers of his legacy still glow wherever ambition whispers that the end justifies the means. And so the scholars keep debating, not because they expect answers, but because the question itself is the safeguard. How do you recognize the shadow before it learns your name? The halls of Valinor are never truly silent, not with the murmur of fountains in Tirion, the distant laughter of the Teleri by the shore, or the rustle of the two trees light through golden leaves. Yet today, the quiet feels heavier, a hush that even the wind respects. The Valor gather not in council, but in shared stillness, their thoughts tracing the same worn path, Mairon. Once, his name had been spoken with pride among the Maiar, a craftsman whose hands shaped wonders even Aulë praised. Now, it lingers like a scar on the air. Man, whose gaze rests on the eastern horizon, where shadows once crept toward Middle-earth. His voice, when it comes, is softer than the breeze. We offered him every path, but the one he chose. The words hang there, unanswered, because the bitter truth is this. The Valor had seen Mairon's brilliance, fraying at the edges long before Morgoth's whispers found him. They'd watched as his forge grew hotter, his designs more relentless, his frustration at imperfection curdling into something darker. Back then, they'd called it passion. Now they name it pride. Varda's stars flicker overhead, their light catching the silver in Nienna's tears. The Lady of Mercy knows grief better than most, her sorrow woven into the very fabric of the world. Could we have reached him, she murmurs, if we'd spoken sooner, if we'd offered not just teaching, but understanding? The question isn't new. They've asked it in 1,000 ways across the ages, each war in Middle-earth reopening the wound. Aulë, standing apart with soot-stained hands clenched, says nothing. His silence is answer enough. He'd been the closest to Mairon, had seen the spark in his eyes when a design clicked into place. But he'd also seen the moment that spark became a furnace, how Mairon began shunning collaboration, dismissing any hand that tried to temper his visions. At the time, Aulë had called it independence. Now he wonders if it was the first step into solitude, into the echo chamber where Morgoth's voice would sound like salvation. Yavanna's fingers brush a sapling in her garden, its leaves trembling as if sensing her unrest. Redemption, she says quietly, requires a hand willing to reach back. And there lies the cruelest twist. Mairon had reached back once, after Morgoth's fall, when his armies lay broken and his purpose shattered. He'd wandered the wastes of Middle-earth alone. The Valor had felt his hesitation like a tremor in the earth, a moment when he might have turned, might have knelt in the ruins and wept. But shame, it seemed, was a heavier chain than any Morgoth forged. By the time he reinvented himself as Annatar, the door had closed. The wind shifts, carrying the scent of salt from the sea. Ulmo, who seldom walks the land, emerges from the waves with water still streaming from his beard. His voice rumbles like distant thunder. We measure our failures in the lives he took. He measured his in the order he failed to impose. The distinction matters. The Valor grieved for what was lost. Sauron had grieved only for what he couldn't control. As twilight deepens, the silence settles again. There's no resolution here. No neat ending to the story. Just the slow acceptance that some falls aren't sudden. They are the sum of 1,000 steps, each one reasonable at the time. The Valor did not fail Mairon in a day. They failed him across centuries, in small moments of missed understanding, in warnings phrased as criticism instead of compassion. And he, in turn, failed himself, mistaking perfection for purpose, control for creation. High above, a single star detaches from the sky, streaking eastward. Arundel's light glimmers on the waves, a reminder that even in the darkest tales, hope persists. But in the gardens of Valinor, where the undying dwell, the knowledge lingers. Redemption is a door that must be walked through, and sometimes, by the time you realize it's there, the hinges have already rusted shut. The wind howled through the jagged peaks of the Erd Lithui, carrying with it the scent of charred earth and old iron. A lone traveler, their cloak frayed from months of wandering, paused to wipe sweat from their brow, then froze. Something glinted amid the scree, a sliver of black metal catching the dying light. It shouldn't have been remarkable. The wastes of Mordor were littered with the debris of war. But this shard hummed, not with sound, but with a vibration that prickled the skin as they reached for it. The moment their fingers closed around it, heat flared, not enough to burn, just enough to unsettle. And then the whisper, not words, not at first, more like the aftertaste of a scream, a ripple of intent that slithered up their arm and coiled behind their eyes. Lift me, it seemed to say, carry me beyond this ruin, and I will show you what the ashes hide. The traveler's breath hitched. They'd heard tales of cursed objects, of artifacts that spoke in the tongues of fallen kings. But those were fireside stories, warnings meant to keep children from straying too far into the wild. This was no fable. The metal pulsed in their grip like a second heartbeat, its rhythm syncing with their own. Around them, the ruins of Mordor lay silent. No birds, no scurrying creatures, just the wind and the weight of centuries pressing down. Yet the shard whispered of secrets buried beneath the cracked earth. Vaults of weapons that never dulled, wells of water that healed any wound, maps to places even the elves had forgotten. Power, it murmured, is not gone, only waiting. The traveler's fingers tightened. They'd come to these wastes seeking nothing but solitude, a place to outrun their own ghosts. But the shard didn't offer oblivion, it offered purpose. High above, the first stars blinked awake. Somewhere to the west, in the rebuilt cities of Gondor, scholars would swear Sauron's influence had been scoured from the land. But darkness doesn't vanish. It pools in the unseen corners, in the cracks between what's remembered and what's ignored. The traveler slipped the shard into their pouch, its warmth seeping through the fabric to brush their hip. They didn't know yet what they carried. They didn't know that relics don't speak unless they've been listened for. And far away, in the deepest pits of Dol Guldur, where even the spiders dared not spin, a wisp of shadow detached itself from the wall. It had no eyes, but it turned eastward all the same. The game, it seemed, was never truly over, only paused. The tale of Sauron ends not with finality, but with a whisper, the kind that slithers through the cracks of history long after the battles are won and the towers have crumbled. His story isn't one of absolute defeat, but of transformation. The Dark Lord's physical form may have dissolved into the winds of Mordor, but the ideas he forged, the fears he weaponized, those linger like smoke after a fire. Middle-earth rebuilds, yes. Kings return to their thrones. Gardens bloom where armies once marched, and children grow up hearing his name as little more than a cautionary tale. But cautionary tales only work if someone's listening. Look closer, and you'll see the fingerprints of his legacy everywhere. In the way Gondor's stewards clutch their authority a little too tightly, their paranoia a ghost of the ring's corruption. In the dwarves' restless digging, their picks striking stone with a rhythm that edges toward obsession. Even in the Shire, where the grass grows thick, and the ale flows freely, there's a tension beneath the laughter, a memory of the scouring, when hobbits learned they too could be cruel. Sauron's greatest trick wasn't the One Ring. It was convincing the world that evil is something you fight once, then forget. The truth is darker. Evil isn't a mountain to be climbed and conquered. It's a tide, receding only to return. Sauron understood that better than anyone. He knew that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it murmurs, offering solutions wrapped in silk. Order for chaos, safety for freedom, progress at any cost. That's why his shadow lingers, not because he was unstoppable, but because his methods were so terribly, tragically human. Who hasn't wrestled with the allure of control? Who hasn't, in their weakest moment, wished for a shortcut to perfection? And so the lesson of Sauron isn't just about a dark lord and a magic ring. It's about the choices we make when no one's watching. The small compromises, the quiet arrogance, the moments we tell ourselves we know better than those who came before. The forge of Barad-dûr may be cold, but its embers scatter far and wide, waiting for the next breath of wind to set them ablaze. Middle-earth survives, but survival isn't the same as immunity. The real question isn't whether darkness will return, it's whether we'll recognize it next time, not as a fiery eye atop a tower, but as the voice in our own heads, whispering that the ends justify the means.